in recent years, with trade as a percentage of world GDP peaking in about 2007 and falling ever since. And the fall in trade has been particularly marked in the last couple of years. We've seen a real drop-off in trade, and it's driven in part by cyclical trends, the slowdown of the international economy, but it's also been driven by tariffs put on by the United States and counter-tariffs put on by China and other U.S. trading partners, and creeping protectionism of other countries as well. So the role of the United States as the traditional architect and defender of the free trade system has really come into question under President Trump. Trade has never been easy politically in the United States or in almost any other country. Historically, there have been big fights, big battles over trade policy in the United States, and this is because trade creates winners and losers in the domestic political economy that then translate into big political fights. But in the United States, some institutional mechanisms were devised to make negotiating and passing trade deals more easy, and a bipartisan consensus around free trade emerged for much of the post-war period and into recent decades. But that consensus has been fraying in the wake of the loss of many manufacturing jobs in the United States and the growing sense that other countries, starting with Japan and now with the focus on China, other countries are not playing fair, playing by the same rules as the United States. So trade politics became very toxic. Obviously, President Trump was elected, and he immediately walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the previous administration had spent many years negotiating, and the Trump administration has taken steps to really neuter the World Trade Organization in their legal system. And so I think one question is, what does this mean for the future of trade? When you look at public opinion polls in the United States, Americans still very much favor free trade. There's very high support for free trade and for globalization. But the politics around trade are not favorable right now. So one question is this the new normal of the United States abdicating its traditional role of leadership for free trade, or will another administration down the line come back to the more traditional role of the United States? So in this panel, we want to look at that. We want to look at the role of other countries and what they are doing to support, to reform, and perhaps to undermine the global free trade regime. And we want to look at the WTO and the global trade system and look at whether it's up to the challenge of being reformed to remain relevant in the digital age and to take on a number of challenges, from services trade and technology trade to bigger challenges like climate change and sustainable development. I have a terrific panel here with me. I'm not going to spend time introducing them in full because you all have your programs. But let me begin with the Minister of Commerce and Industry from India, who we're delighted to have with us today, Mr. Piyush Goyal. Minister, if you could share with us India's perspective of these trends. India obviously has played a very significant role within the WTO historically and in the Doha round. And so when we look at the WTO and the challenges of making it relevant and viable again, very interested in your views. And also it was quite striking that India walked away from the agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which took some steps towards being finalized this past November in Bangkok, and India stepped outside of that. And if you could share with us what India's thinking is about regional trade agreements in the multilateral trade system.
Thank you, Amy, and a warm welcome to all the participants who have come from different parts of the world, and our Member of Parliament from Germany. At the outset, India very strongly believes in multilateralism. But I think the subject at hand today targets one individual quite unfairly. I think it may make good copy for newspaper and may make nice headlines. But what I believe President Trump did is just a wake-up call. It's not as if these problems were not existing before. It's not as if multilateralism or WTO was performing very well or very, very efficiently. Over the years, we've seen cracks developing in the free trade as it was originally envisaged. Very clearly, countries were putting up borders to trade. There was huge element of unfair trade practices that were there, possibly may not have been as openly discussed, but the subtext of free trade was clearly missing. And to my mind, in the new normal as you suggested, while there may be some uncertainties, these trade wars may lead to some kind of upheaval in the short run. In the long run, this debate that has happened over the last 3 years, in the long run, this concern around trade deficits, in the long run, this concern about reciprocal and fair access on both sides is something that augurs well for the world. It augurs well for more fair trade practices amongst countries. We in India have clearly faced discrimination, clearly faced a lot of unfair trade practices from different countries around the world. We are in the process of bringing out all of these issues, bringing them in the right perspective, placing them before our trading partners ourselves. That was one of the reasons that we were not able to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because very clearly the partnership was not amongst equals. One will have to recognize that any arrangement, any multilateral, regional, comprehensive or international arrangement will have to recognize the realities of different geographies, different sizes of the countries, different populations, different political systems of governance, different levels of prosperity. Unless we factor in all of these and then create a far more rules-based multilateral trading system, I think logically what happened 3 years ago would have happened possibly 5 years later, but by then things would have gone very much out of hand. I think it's a good wake-up call for all of us around the world. At least we in India are finding some of these issues to be very relevant to our trading with other countries and our trading concerns with other countries. And I believe that in India there is a thing called Manthan. Manthan is what happened when there was a lot of turmoil and upheaval in mythology in the old days. And it is believed in India that after this turmoil, what emerges will always be good for humanity. And I'm very optimistic, I'm very confident that all that we see today is only going to be for the better of multilateralism, what my Prime Minister called in the last BRICS conference, reformed multilateralism, is what this world is looking for.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Can you say a few words about India's decision to not join the RCEP?
Well, RCEP as a formulation had 16 countries, most of whom already had trading arrangements intersay each other. So India had a trading arrangement with ASEAN countries. We had trading arrangements with Korea and Japan already. New Zealand was a very small player in our trade basket. Australia is an important player, but we have a very few defined items. And intersay Australia and India, we really don't have any problems in even expanding our trade. But we also had China in that room, with whom we have very serious concerns about the way they are carrying out their trade, about the way Chinese ecosystem is locked down for fair trade practices with other countries. And we in India have found that, I'll give you a small statistic. Between 2003-04 and 13-14, in 10 years, our trade deficit with the RCEP countries grew 10 times, from barely $7 billion to about $65-70 billion. Today, I have a trade deficit of $105 billion, which is more than 2/3 of my world trade deficit with the RCEP countries. And a lot of it, when I go into detail, comes because of lack of fair access in these countries to Indian products. It's because of lockdown in one way or the other, through non-tariff measures, through different practices that are carried out by these countries. We were not able to get fair access for our industry. Services, in any case, is an area which is very important for India. And the services was a low ambition agreement in RCEP. And end of the day, on balance, I realized and my government realized that this would be only to the detriment of India's domestic industry to get into the RCEP unless we got credible, fair, and accountable resolution of our concerns around circumvention of product origin rules, around the base year around from which this agreement would take off, about the effort by different countries to give good access, fair access to my products or Indian products, about the collective effort of all countries to help us bridge this huge 105 billion trade deficit that India is carrying with the RCEP countries. I think the other countries were not in a position in the short time frame to resolve all these issues. And it would have been possibly a good diplomatic move, but certainly a bad trade decision to be a part of RCEP. And I think trade will have to stand on its own legs and cannot be dictated purely by diplomatic concerns.
Well, speaking of concerns about China, India is certainly not the only country that has trade concerns, and this has been a central feature of President Trump's trade policy. I believe there was just a phase one agreement reached and signed in Washington on the trade dispute, but all signs point to rivalry, economic rivalry between the United States and China continuing for some time, and in particular, you know, the national security concerns around technology, as well as commercial concerns, are likely to continue to shape U.S. trade policy. So this has led to a lot of talk about decoupling, decoupling of the U.S. and China economies, and perhaps broader decoupling in the world around different economic systems, technology standards, internet governance systems, et cetera. And decoupling has been happening on both sides. Of course, China has decoupled to some degree through its great firewall of internet protection, through the Made in China 2025 program, which has been designed to develop, to move China away from foreign-based, foreign manufactured technology towards Chinese goods. But the Trump administration has certainly taken steps that are seen as aimed towards decoupling as well. So let me turn to Jeff Bialos to my right. He is a partner at Evershed Sutherland, a global law firm, but he has an extensive background on these issues as former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense on a lot of commercial issues and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Import Administration. So, Jeff, when we think about decoupling and what the U.S. administration is doing now, looking at critical or strategic technology sectors, 5G, cloud computing, semiconductors, what are these the sectors? Are there other kinds of technologies that are being looked at for trade and investment restrictions? And how far is this going to go, do you think, in terms of really trying to block technologies from flowing to China or block Chinese access to critical infrastructure in the United States?
Thanks, Amy, for the question, and a pleasure to be here today at Raisina with our colleagues here on the stage. Before I answer your question, just one quick response to what the minister said, and I take your point very much, sir, that Donald Trump didn't invent the problems here. He picked up on those in the United States who felt left behind by globalization, and in a certain sense, it was a brilliant political insight to do that. What I will say, however, is that you don't solve the fraying edges of a multilateral trade system through unilateral and bilateral solutions and by taking steps to kill the appellate body, which essentially makes it into a free-for-all. So that's just a brief aside. But in answer to your question, I think you have to look at this all in context. Most of this program has been about what's been going on in the security arena, Indo-Pacific. We heard a lot of comments about that. And in that area, the United States is working very collectively and cooperatively with India and other countries. and a quadrilateral effort has been underway, and I think indeed there probably is room to do more in formalizing that architecture. But in this decoupling area, the U.S. has taken a different approach. And it's framed from the notion that we have a China reset on China and Russia, great power competition, and that China has gone on an extended campaign to take American technology, either legally in some cases or in other cases illegally. I constantly hear that they are taking it from classified companies and indeed companies with new technologies before they are classified. And there's a bipartisan consensus on that in Washington in an era of divided government where we have no consensus on most anything. So because of that, there really has been this move afoot. You mentioned 5G. There's a procurement ban of buying, U.S. government buying goods or services involving Chinese 5G service products and equipment. There's a sanctions prospect. There's export controls on Huawei and others. But it's much deeper than that. We have put in place through CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, it's a dirty word to a lot of people these days, a new set of rules just got announced while I was here to implement a law that puts in place CFIUS on steroids, I call it, meaning much broader look at foreign acquisitions. And there's no doubt about the thrust is on China. It's been used to deny a lot of Chinese deals. And the operating assumption CFIUS makes means they're going to be significant parts of the U.S. economy that Chinese companies can't invest in a range of emerging and dual-use technologies, from artificial intelligence to autonomy to hypersonics and so forth. There's a companion export control law that went into effect where they're looking to add a whole series of dual-use technologies to the list. And again, it's driven by China and the desire to impose these new export controls on China and deny China the ability to get access to new technologies which may inform its ability to undermine the U.S. technologically based military edge. So I think there's export controls. The administration is going to universities, advising with the risks of having Chinese students and taking grants from Chinese companies. There is enormous effort on supply chain resilience in the United States in the defense and aerospace sector, led by the Defense Department, to essentially deny risky components and services throughout the system, which again read China. So this is a deep, broad thrust with support from the intel community and the defense community. And the issues are, can it work? And is it, what's the price and the cost of this to the United States? And let me just say one other point before I briefly mention each of those, which is, look, a lot of this stems from the notion, what I call this China narrative of what the Chinese are doing. You know, we spent, the administration, the past administration spent 20 years trying to integrate China into the world economy on the theory that this will lead to political and economic reform. It didn't work. And there's a feeling that we had to do something different, and this is something different. That said, and you know, and President Xi has acquired power to himself, unlike even what we've seen in the past in the Communist Party. That said, I would say I'm not sure we're at the end of history here. And I think we're putting a lot of eggs in this decoupling basket at a time when there are countervailing tendencies in Chinese society, and we're going to be encouraging them too. But on the efficacy of what they're doing, just briefly, you know, first of all, it's hard to see the rest of the world's going to go along with this. And my mother taught me that unilateral controls don't work well. And even in 5G, which is the one where we have the best case, arguably, for this, there's not a lot of traction to that. Second of all, you're trying to control technologies that are inherently digital. They're in the air. They're diffused through the global economy. And how do you put controls on artificial intelligence unless you do it at a very high end? You know, and there are prices to be paid. And in these new investment rules that just came out today, the only countries exempt from the rules are the UK, Canada, and Australia. Everybody else in the world is subject to CFIUS on steroids, meaning that the United States will essentially make it hard to collaborate with other Western countries and their firms in these nouveau areas that will inform military capability. We're leading toward a world of two technology flows, one with the US and countries that play ball, and the other that's more China-centric and with countries and companies that don't. And the consequences is, ironically, this is all national security driven. I think it arguably undermines national security in the United States and its allies in some ways, because it precludes us from getting access to technology flows that might inform our continued military advantage.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm curious if our European friends on the panel will have comments about how, if they think it's workable to sort of divide the world in these two technology flows, and if it would be easy for them to do that. But let me ask. Actually, we have Vita Poon, who is the Director for International Finance from Her Majesty's Treasury from the UK. And Vita, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I also have a question for you about the WTO and whether it's fit for purpose in a number of ways, including in the digital era. Are there ways that the WTO can be made to be more relevant and more responsive to digital economy issues? Do we want to focus on efforts to ensure the free flow and exchange of data and wide-ranging protections of intellectual property and individual data? Is this something that we should be talking about at the WTO, or is that an impossible goal?
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's a huge privilege to be on this panel in the presence of the minister as well. I have to say, I'm not a trade expert, so those who have direct answers to Amy's questions, feel free to put your hand up. And I also see the clock is ticking. I just wanted to kind of maybe give a few reflections off the back of what the minister said on reformed multilateralism, and maybe just address a few of the WTO points. I think this panel is about trade, but I think I'm glad you talked about reformed multilateralism, because it's not just in the area where you need reform and how we work together. I think oftentimes global economic governance and the institutions set up to support that lag behind developments in the real economy. And I think a lot of what Jeffrey said, developments in AI and technology and data, I think there's a whole set of questions out there, whether the institutions set up, after 1945, are they sufficient? Do they need to be reformed in terms of how quickly they reach agreement on new rules? But also, do we need to set up new institutions? And I don't have an answer to that, but I would observe that genuinely governance arrangements, are often decades behind where the real economy is. So I think something to kind of bear in mind, and maybe you've just come up with your theme for the G20 in 2022, who knows? But we look forward to working with India on that side. The other thing I would just observe very quickly is in terms of how trade policy is made. I think Jeffrey, you kind of alluded to that in your remarks, but just from my own humble experience as a civil servant in the UK, and I was also posted in Brussels in between 2015 and 2018, it's really struck me how trade policy isn't really the sole purview, if you like, of trade policy analysts and trade negotiators. It's very much about kind of real economic and regulatory policy, and increasingly we're needing to find new ways in bureaucracies to work between foreign policy, economic policy, domestic regulatory policy. And I think there's a kind of real slightly nerdy and bureaucratic question for us civil servants as to how we get the best setup domestically within national governments to actually coordinate what we call trade policy, because it's really shifted from just being about tariffs to being about a whole bunch of things where increasingly you need, as the minister mentioned, you do need to flush out the domestic interests, figure out where their interests are, and really have that lively debate. Even if it's going to be difficult, you're going to have that out there, because increasingly I think the publics demand democratic accountability on trade policy. So I just wanted to kind of make that observation. Just on your trade policy point, I mean, sitting in a finance ministry, trade tensions do have economic cost, and I think the IMF put out an estimate, even for the first quarter of last year, 2019, given trade tensions, I think they estimated that global GDP could drop by 0.75%, which is quite a lot. And so as policymakers, especially as a finance ministry and also with other economics ministries, we can't ignore that. And I think the minister was I think very kind of apt in saying, look, there's lots of negative headlines, but just how do we go about having a more positive agenda on trade, right? Because you can pontificate for a very long time about trade tensions, and of course there are issues to resolve, but what is the positive agenda on multilateral trade for the 21st century? And I know A famous German politician mentioned that, if you have visions, you're probably hallucinating. I think that may be Helmut Schmidt, but I forget which one. You will correct me. But I do think, in all this conversation, we mustn't forget that trade policy and trade liberalization does have a human side to it. As far as I understand, over the last 25 years, trade liberalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. I think the IMF have done studies that, the income of the bottom 20% in a lot of countries, that has a kind of real correlation with opening trade and trade openness. So I think these are all kind of, human impacts that we can't ignore. And this is also part of the reason why the UK was so kind of upfront in 2015 when we had the Bali ministerial, and when I think it was, it's the only actually truly multilateral trade agreement that we reached on the trade facilitation agreement, which is simply about, cutting red tape and, reducing kind of customs barriers. And I think, that was the last one we did. So the question is what next? So I think we should have a positive agenda, and I think, there are kind of probably three things on that front. Amy, to your question on, the WTO, whether it's fit for purpose. Again, I'm not a WTO expert, but it strikes me that, I think certainly from a UK perspective, we want to see an independent dispute settlement mechanism, a binding one, and an independent adjudication process there. And I think, we want to keep working with others, including our European colleagues, to kind of push that, because we can't have a trading system where everyone kind of each does their own thing, and you don't have a common set of rules. That just simply doesn't work. So we're really keen to be on the front foot on that. I think on services liberalization, this is something that we talk about actually quite a lot, in G20 meetings and even amongst sort of finance ministries, because actually, in the past and even currently we talk about goods, but services is the real driver of trade growth. I think there's a lot of numbers out there, but I think the proportion of growth in trade has been really fueled by services, and a lot of that is driven by technology, and data is the new commodity, right? There's another panel somewhere, I'm sure, that talks about kind of commodities of the 21st century, but data and the digital services, that come with harvesting that data is really the bread and butter of a lot of services trade. And so, for example, in the OECD, they've started doing this work on, how do you reach a global agreement on taxation of digital services? And I think there's a big question for the WTO on the trade side, sort of, whether it's willing to kind of move forward on e-commerce and other types of digital services to kind of really bring our rules up to speed. I think the third area I would just mention, and I will stop there because I'm sure there will be further discussion on this, I think the kind of nexus between trade and sustainable growth, trade and climate change is probably underexplored at the moment. I remember probably several Davoses ago, there was an initiative around an environmental green goods agreement, and others around the room and on this panel will know where that has ended up and whether there's a prospect of another green goods agreement or even a green services agreement. But where there is a will, I feel there is a way. But the issue is if so in the UK we're doing a study, within the finance ministry of how we reach net zero emissions by 2050, and it's very clear that a lot of countries around the world will have to find a pathway to low carbon economy, and within that you're going to have to think about what are the different types of inputs that go into goods. Can you have more green services to support those goods? And basically the kind of nature of our trade will have to become greener to sustain and to reach that goal of net zero emissions by 2050 and even to kind of meet the Paris Agreement. So, I think it would be worth exploring that nexus a little bit. I know there have been discussions about things like carbon border adjustments, and there are kind of pros and cons of that. But I think that is the next frontier where policymakers and heads of international institutions kind of really need to explore, because you've got a big groundswell of movement to say actually we need new rules in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Vita mentioned, the WTO has really stalled in progress in passing many agreements on trade liberalization in really recent decades. And now with the growing uncertainty about the trade rules that are embodied in the WTO, how well they'll be enforced in the WTO legal system, and without the backing of the U.S. trying to reinforce or promote these rules, there's a lot more uncertainty about trade flows, and partly as a result of that, we've seen a flurry of negotiations around bilateral and regional trade agreements despite Brexit, which is moving in the opposite direction perhaps, but we see a lot of countries negotiating. We've talked about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which now has 15 countries. That looks like that's moving forward. TPP, after the United States walked away, Japan and Australia picked that up and got that over the finish line with their 11 partners, and it's now been ratified by 9 members, and there's potentially going to be more countries joining TPP over the next year or so. And the EU has been very active in negotiating a number of trade agreements with Singapore and Vietnam and Indonesia and many other countries, and Japan. So let me turn now to Alexander Kulitz, who is a member of parliament from Germany and is a spokesperson for his party group on foreign economic affairs and trade. Alex, can you share with us the thinking in the EU about these bilateral and regional trade agreements that the EU has been actively involved in? Is this seen as a sufficient way to maintain momentum towards trade liberalization, or is there real concern about the dreaded spaghetti bowl of trade agreements?
Well, thanks, Amy, and thanks, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for having the chance to speak up. I can't speak for the European Union, unfortunately, but I'm sure we're going to get a chance tonight to ask Mr. Borrell. But I can certainly point out the German view, and I believe Germany has a little saying within the European Union. So, as you might know, Germany is very dependent on trade. Our economy, which is very much, we call them German Mittelstand, a lot of small, medium-sized companies, mainly family-owned. But with, we call them the hidden champions with the world market share. So we are very dependent on trade, and we're very lucky that the European Union already started before we had the whole issue with the WTO, et cetera, going into these negotiation on free trade agreements and other things. Now we're lucky. Why? Because in many cases, we do have different kind of dispute settlement within these treaties. With the situation now at the WTO not having a working dispute settlement anymore because the appellate body is dead, we're very fortunate to have it at least in some of the free trade agreements. And trade is, well, it's the prosperity of wealth to everybody. That's been like that in history for centuries. And so we're very much looking also onto the new European Commission and the new European government, if you want to, on what will happen in this decade and what will happen in the next steps. And of course, I would also very much hope on India that perhaps with the Modi too, with the new government, and Germany has a big interest in also getting things done on that side, and it would be very nice to achieve some, to get further on. But some issues were mentioned already, and Veda was talking also about the questions on all these other topics that are very important nowadays, the human factor on it. When we talk about sustainability, when we talk about environmental things, etc. Now, my personal opinion is it's not a very good idea to put all that into these comprehensive free trade agreements, but that's what's happening at the moment. And that's a bit, if I look at the issue that the European Union has at the moment within its own countries, when it comes to the Mercosur treaty, for example, we have been negotiating for almost 20 years now with the Mercosur countries to have a free trade agreement. Everything's on the table, and suddenly everything collapses again. It started probably with France and Macron doubting whether this is the right idea. I believe it's more the agricultural part in France that was in Germany. Now there's a huge debate due to the fact that the sustainable chapter is not enough, or is not be sufficient. Now the whole thing is at risk. After 20 years of negotiation, after seeing the WTO is not able to fulfill what they are there for. So yes, I completely agree we need to reform, but I disagree with the way the Americans, which are by far our most important allies, tackle the issue. It's not by destroying everything and then thinking, okay, that's the way to get a reform. This kind of maximum pressure strategy is the worst thing, in my opinion, they can do. And it's forcing also mainly the allies on the European side, including Germany, the way they kind of address it. We got tariffs now on steel and aluminium, etc., etc. We always have, since the beginning, since Trump got into office, we got this this thing about cars being an issue of national security, whether they should be imported, in the import tariffs in the United States, etc., etc. That's not the way to go forward. I mean, we have to reflect on what is trade for. Why do we have the WTO? Why do we have trade agreements? On the long run, it's for the companies. It's for our industries. It's not for us lawmakers or bureaucrats to sit there and make it even more complicated, even more. No, on the end, we need to assure or make sure somehow that the world mechanism is working. And unfortunately, Doha didn't work out. This would have been the greatest thing ever, but it didn't work out. So now we have to sit back together and try to be a little more pragmatic. And Mr. Minister, I think, yes, you're right in one sense. Probably Trump was a wake-up call, but I wouldn't call it a wake-up call. It was rather a bucket of cold water in the face of the rest of the world. Because as I said, I don't think the right way is to destroy things we have and then try to renegotiate them. I know the administration does that quite often in the United States, this hard pressure or maximum pressure strategy. I believe it makes much more sense to take the existing and try to at least take the existing and make it work more properly for this upcoming digital age. And even if there's points, it was pointed out, digital services, those kind of things. So even if I hear all this, all the time we hear about all the surpluses that Germany has, yes, well, but we don't have Google, we don't have Amazon, we don't have Facebook, we don't have any digital services. If I take those into account, and to be honest, I have to agree with the French. If they put up a tax, then suddenly the US administration goes crazy on that, putting sanctions on French champagne and whatever, just due to the fact that they put a tax on something. It's just exactly vice versa, the same thing that they've been doing. I mean, let's be honest, if we talk about a surplus, we have to take these things into account. There is old industries, I'd call them, like in Germany, with a lot of machine manufacturing products, with etc., car manufacturing. But there's also a lot of new industries evolving, especially in the digital sectors. Are they taking into account? Not really. So yes, that is a point where we really have to look at when we reform the WTO. There is negotiations going on, but the way we do it, I think it's the wrong way.
Well, there are a lot of diverse and interesting thoughts on the table. I think one thing we can all agree on is it is a terrible idea to put tariffs on French champagne. But with that, let me move to the audience for question and answer. And as tradition at Raisina Dialogue, I'm going to turn to young leaders first and take a couple of questions from you, which we'll then pose to the audience, and then we'll pose to our panel, and then we'll go to the broader audience. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mitali Mukherjee. I'm from India. I'm seeking the Commerce Minister's views on 2 points. Jeff Bezos from Amazon is in India currently, sadly not at Raisina. He has committed $1 billion to India. Even as he does that, a traders association that represents 70 million traders claims that Amazon has been indulging in false practices and flouting the FDI rules. I'm wondering how India can incubate investment in a scenario where there is strong domestic pushback. That's point one. The second point, Commerce Minister, is with regards to our imports. In 2019, we imposed trade curbs on Malaysia. We are reportedly considering that for Turkey as well, and you have indicated that you might be considering putting some kind of restrictions on imports in the others category that translates to about $100 billion. I'm wondering what signal that sends out to the global community when we are putting these riders down in terms of our imports. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, you spoke about Amazon, and I would assume you're talking about the e-commerce ecosystem as a whole. Whether Mr. Bezos is here or no is not for me to decide. That's for the organizers to take a call. But the reality is that very recently I read that the Competition Commission of India, based on their preliminary findings, has already initiated an inquiry into the business practices of Amazon. I don't know whether Amazon or both Amazon and Flipkart. And that is certainly an area of concern for every Indian. We did allow e-commerce entities to come into India in the marketplace model. A marketplace model, just so that we are all on the same page, is an agnostic platform where buyers and sellers are free to trade, come onto the platform for what they want to buy. Sellers are free to offer their products, and if buyers and sellers agree, then the transaction is between the seller and the buyer. The marketplace cannot own the inventory, cannot have control on the inventory, cannot determine prices, cannot have algorithms to determine which product will get a preeminent position or would be given a market preference when offered to the buyers. There are several established rules of a marketplace. I think as long as everybody follows those rules, we very much welcome e-commerce into India, and they're happy to come and trade and serve the people of India. We have very strict rules about FDI in multi-brand retail, where only 49% is allowed. And anybody who tries to use the e-commerce marketplace model to get into the multi-brand retail space surreptitiously will have to be questioned and will have to be investigated. Whether they are doing that or not is a matter for the investigators to decide. It's not my call. I think we'll leave that job to the persons who are expected to look at the business practices of different companies, and whatever would be their findings should be respected by everybody. But I have on more than one occasion, including in this very room, maybe 6 or 7 times, said this to the people of India and to all investors, that please follow the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Don't try to find loopholes within the defined letter of the law alone, when very clearly we have articulated what the e-commerce marketplace model is. Secondly, they may have put in $1 billion, but then if they make a loss of $1 billion every year, then they jolly well have to finance that $1 billion. So it's not as if they're doing a great favor to India when they invest $1 billion. They are investing money over the last few years, also in warehousing and certain other activities, which is welcome, which is good. But if they are bringing in money largely to finance losses, and those losses in an e-commerce marketplace model, a fair marketplace model in a turnover of $10 billion, if you're going to have a loss of $1 billion, $1.5 billion, it certainly raises questions where the loss came from. How can a marketplace make such a big loss unless they are indulging in predatory pricing or some unfair trade practices? These are real questions which will need answers, and I'm sure the authorities who are looking at it will seek those answers, and I'm sure the e-commerce companies will have their say on that. I don't think we have put any curbs on imports from Malaysia. Neither are we contemplating that. Nor have we put any curbs on Turkey. Nor are we contemplating that. India believes in fair play and equal treatment to all. Any curbs that we put in the best interests of India's trade and international trade, apply to all countries uniformly. And if some of the restrictions impact Malaysia, I don't think that would be the only country that is impacted. There would be other exporters to India who would have the same impact. And lastly, to your question about others category, the idea came to me from the Germans who were in the room when we were having our quality conclave yesterday. We have 1 out of 4 items, nearly $100 billion of imports, actually more, about $130 billion of imports being categorized in the HSN code as others. Now, we don't know what those others are. We have no way to verify what is the product that's coming into the country amongst the various lines in that code. And I think it's only fair, and the German friends said that in their country, they just don't allow anybody to bring anything in the others category. I think I've been trying for the last 6 months to assess what does India import. And every time I try to do that, I'm stonewalled with a huge number of others. I think it's only fair that all importers categorize that product in an HSN code. If there is a product which doesn't get fit into any of those codes, I've simultaneously announced that please approach us. We'll create new codes or we'll expand the existing codes. But I think it's every nation's right, and for that matter, duty as Commerce Minister to my people to know what is being imported into the country. It also opens up opportunity for other countries. Suppose I'm getting a product, let's say from Singapore, in the others category. Maybe somebody from Germany or somebody from the US or somebody from UK may like to offer that product also to India at better and competitive terms. Maybe somebody in India may want to start producing that product. I think it's important that we know exactly what is being imported, whether it's being imported at the right classification, and open the market up to other players so that there's more transparency. This is a move towards transparency and more fair trading practices.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together in the interest of time. So This young leader first.
Yes, hello and thank you for the presentation. My name is Nicolás. I'm from Uruguay. And as you know, the main difference between these current trade tensions that we see nowadays with others in the past is that the world nowadays is more integrated by preferential trade agreements and global value chains. So what do you think is the role of these important factors of interdependencies and integration in these current trade tensions? Because it seems that they are not limiting trade protectionism. So data shows that could be limiting tariff, but maybe non-tariff protectionism. For more specifically, what do you think is the role of PTAs and global value chains in these trade tensions?
Okay, thank you. Over here, we have a question. Yes, sir.
Sir, my question is to Mr. Commerce Minister. As Indian economy is not growing as predicted, and on the other hand, organizations including World Bank downgraded growth projection from 6.5 to 5%. So, sir, my question is, how can we achieve 5 trillion economy by 2024? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question back there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. So the question is to Minister Goyal and Director Poon. So over the years, we have seen a consistent trend from countries moving from multilateral organizations such as WTO, multilateral trade deals such as TPP and RCEP, to bilateral platforms such as Indo-US deal, as echoed by your leadership. So do you think that this trend is going to continue over the years and it's going to intensify?
Okay, let me take one more question. This gentleman here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Patrick Kugiel from the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. Since there was already mentioned the negotiations ongoing for the last 13 years.
What's this question to? We didn't figure out.
This is the question to Indian Minister.
And that for you, this is also for you, this question.
I'm
yes.
not able to understand.
Okay.
You'll have to be a little more.
Go ahead.
It was already mentioned that ongoing negotiations between the European Union and India on the ambitious free trade agreement. So I would like to ask you to tell us what's the current status of those negotiations, and if you see any prospects for concluding those negotiations in a foreseeable future. And in addition to this, if you can tell us also your take on whether you consider seriously FTA with the United States at this moment.
Whether I consider?
An FTA with the United States. So we'll go to you first, Minister. You have the question about growth. Is India moving more from multilateral regional trade agreements to bilateral trade agreements, and specifically India-EU, India-US FTAs?
But there was a question first to, I think, the member.
And a question that others in the panel may want to answer too, about the role of interdependencies and the role of interdependencies and trade agreements in terms of whether they're intensifying the trade tensions right now. Do I have that question right? Yeah. Okay.
First one?
Sure. No, of course. I mean, to be very honest, I believe this is the main danger, because if you look about all the America first and what you name it, every country first, if we destroy these global value chains, if we destroy the interdependency between each other, what will actually happen? And that's all about the decoupling, Jeff, you were talking about. What will happen in the end? Well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but if we are completely independent of the other, of course, it's also a huge security issue, to be honest, because it's much easier tackling, or like another foreign minister said yesterday, bullying on others, the minute I don't have to expect that it will hurt myself in any way. And that's the huge, huge risk on destroying all these global value chains. Why are they so important? What is the big benefit of this globalization? Well, in the end, it's best if everybody does what he does best. So if a country like Germany, well, it's rather cold, especially now in January. It will be hard to grow some oranges in Germany at the moment. So why should I grow them in Germany in a house? No, definitely, this is what trade is for. I need the oranges from Spain, or the papayas from South Africa, or whatever, and that's what the whole thing is for. And of course, nowadays, in a very complicated digital world, things are way more than just an orange or a banana. And this is why we have to do anything to safeguard these international value chains and to make sure that the independencies stay and don't vanish. That's my personal opinion, though, not my party opinion and not the German government's opinion.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn to Jeff.
So on the interdependence, again, it cuts back to a point I made before, which is that we spent 30 years collectively, countries in allowing, integrating China into the global economy, for example, you can't just turn it off with a split switch, all right? You can't just turn the switch and suddenly decouple from anybody, and especially China. It's too integral part of the world economy today. You know, trade agreements or no trade agreements, there is mutual interdependencies. And it's kind of interesting because we're doing a U.S. trade agreement with China today on one level, but in this security area, it's something different. And I do think when you look at global supply chains, to take the point that was just made, you know, there is an increased focus on resilience in global supply chains and looking at those risks. We've always had those issues, but people have been willing to accept, you know, there's some business incentives to avoid risk. So, for example, I've sat in on the discussion on 5G this afternoon, and the technical experts say that there's no way of mitigating those technical risks, and I accept that. Risk that, you know, Huawei or whoever might turn off, might disrupt a 5G network, or might, you know, excuse me, the risk that they can use it for surveillance. But what I would say to you is, what we need to find is a more multifaceted way of dealing with these issues, where we try to mitigate risks in a range of ways. So, for example, you know, there must be economic ways to mitigate risks. If Huawei or whoever does that and it's found out, no one's going to use their goods or services again. And you could take contractual means to do that. So I think there's some other ways than black and white here to address these risks, and I think that's part of the problem in the system today.
Vida, you had a comment?
So I don't want to prolong the discussion, but it was an excellent question from the colleague from Uruguay. The only thing I would just add, I think global value chains, it's not static. They change all the time, and I think there have been numerous studies done by the OECD trying to map global value chains of kind of various sectors, but the reality is that they kind of change, and you know, it's sort of like whack-a-mole. If you're trying to, you know, break off a value chain, it kind of pops up somewhere else. And so I don't think, like, maybe I'm being unambitious, you'll never get to the bottom of like the true structure of global value chains. I think what it does point to, though, is, you know, if there is a kind of, you know, if there are blunt tools being used to you know, close off trade or penalize kind of partners and trade actors, you know, there are unintended consequences, right? So just to give an example, you know, I'm not naming any country in particular, but like every time, you know, a particular firm or a particular type of company gets put on a list somewhere, and you know, it's not just that firm, it's the suppliers of that firm, and also because companies are structured in such a complex way, multinationally, you know, holding companies of certain kind of, you know, regional companies, you never quite know who it is that you're trying to capture, and, you know, countries then have to end up, you know, explaining to their domestic stakeholders, well, what's happened here, and, you know, what do you do to mitigate it? So, you know, GVC sounds like it's very complex and it's very techy, but the reality is that it keeps moving all the time, and I don't think any study will ever do it justice.
Minister Goyal?
Since this subject has already been addressed, I'll focus on what was raised about India. Certainly, growth in India has seen a slowdown in the last few quarters, but it's a part of the international or the global interconnections that India also is now suffering from. Global challenges, uncertainties within the country also. I think over a period of time, certain issues that came to fore, for example, environmental issues caused us to take a call that we'll move to BS6, which is a more environmentally friendly, efficient standard for our auto industry. Now that has pulled back the growth in the auto industry in the last year and a half. And while they are resetting their technologies to go towards BS6, the customer base also is slowing down its purchases so that they'll take a more modern or a better vehicle once you have a fuel-efficient or environmentally friendly vehicle. Similarly, we've been cleaning up our banking system. We've been trying to clean up a lot of irregularities in the real estate sector. And this is a period, again, of churn, which does cause a short-term pain or some stresses in the economy. But I personally believe that in the long run, we are moving towards a situation that the world recognizes India as a fair place to do business in, as an honest economy, where everybody gets equal opportunity. There's no rent seeking, there's no favors to one set of people over the other. And I think this churn will do India in the long run a lot of good. As far as moving out of multilateralism is concerned, that's absolutely not the intention. Moving out of RCEP has its own very well-defined reasons. We are very much a part of WTO. We are very much wanting to strengthen WTO along with other stakeholders. In fact, we were amongst the first four countries to pay all our dues to WTO. I think many of the other countries have still not paid even their dues to WTO. And we believe that India will have to protect its interests, whether it's a bilateral agreement or a multilateral agreement. Bilaterally, there's an advantage that what I had mentioned earlier about different geographies, different political environments, different levels of prosperity, income levels. For example, the farmers in India at an average have a hectare or two on which they are cultivating. Hence, productivity is low, costs are high, efficiencies are stressed. But if I have to compete with a farmer in Russia, a farmer in Brazil, a farmer in the United States, who has 1,000 hectares or 5,000 hectares. In Russia, I met somebody the other day who had 100,000 hectares. Now, that's a very unfair competition. And in a bilateral agreement, we can try and address those unfair differences in trade. In multilateral arrangements, there will always be a stress that we may not be able to address all these concerns because the countries on the other side have very, very different levels of prosperity and population and their own circumstances. As far as the EU is concerned, we are waiting for the EU to take charge. We have had very, very positive interactions with Germany, for example, with France, with several other countries who are very keen that India and EU enter into at least to begin with a PTA, maybe moving towards an FTA. And I'm looking forward to my engagement with the EU Commission, the new Commission that's just come into play. We are very keen to pursue that dialogue further. Earlier, the dialogue was stalled largely on wines, spirits, and automobiles. I think those are not as contentious issues today. However, issues around agriculture, issues around non-tariff barriers, the TBTs and SPS protocols, those will also find center stage in any new negotiations that we do, bilaterally or multilaterally with any countries. With the US, we are at an advanced stage of dialogue to sort out some of the pressing issues. But certainly, I do believe that at some stage, India and the United States, both of us are very culturally, historically, both large, flourishing democracies, are right partners, trading partners, who can expand trade, who can work with each other. And I would believe that going forward, both countries would like to further expand our engagement, which could lead to PTAs and FTAs in the years ahead.
We are almost out of time. I just want to give our panelists just one more opportunity to say, a line or two of additional thoughts they may have. We haven't really been able to touch on what the decoupling trend might mean for other countries in Southeast Asia or India or other countries if we have bifurcated supply chains and different technological systems. And we haven't been able to talk that much about how the global trade agreements can be used to tackle sustainable development, including things like water resources and transnational water management issues. So if you have any thoughts about that or any takeaway thoughts from the conversation so far, this is your opportunity to share with us. Jeff, can I turn to you first?
I'm going to say what I said before. On China, while there is a sense to decoupling at very high levels of technology, and maybe we can be successful there and effective, we're not at the end of history with China. And the fact that 25 years of constructive engagement hasn't worked doesn't mean we shouldn't have more of an element of that involved. On the broader trade scenario, I see very rough seas ahead, and it's hard for me to see bringing in issues like sustainable development or whatever into a system that is being tested at the edges. The United States has taken a range of actions unilaterally, calling it national security, like auto, steel, and aluminum, which allows the United States to say that these are exemptions from the WTO. And I think If they go down that road, and if there's a second term for the president, I think we may be headed to very rough seas where the system breaks apart.
Okay, thank you. One comment? No? Okay, Minister?
Well, I think since I also handle railways in India, and I use a lot of couplers in the train system that I run, I think rather than just focusing on decoupling, it's time all of us started addressing the issue of recoupling. Well, there are certain challenges which have come to fore. The iceberg is now kind of out in the open. And I think all of us will have to start addressing these issues, whether it's data, whether it's trade, whether it's investments, whether it's immigration, whether it's services. All of these issues will now be recoupled with newer ways of looking at things. I think all countries are becoming very conscious of fair play, which is why I said we need a reformed multilateralism around the world. The United States and India are quite aligned in our thinking in terms of trading practices over the last several decades, having got into some kind of a situation which needs to be relooked at, reassessed, to ensure not only fair play inter-se countries, but fair play inter-se people. So we'll have to make trade policies more and more people-centric as we go forward. And when we are talking of people-centric policies, it will look at sustainability, it will look at elimination of poverty, bringing up levels of prosperity in the less developed world. I think all of these will be real issues that the world will have to address.
Thank you. Alexander?
I completely agree that we have to tackle all these challenges, and I believe that's what multilateral organizations such as the WTO are for. I'm not a big fan of the idea of pressing all these things into a trade agreement. A trade agreement is supposed to be a trade agreement, so we shouldn't put all the other things that are very necessary, and on the state level we have to negotiate them and we have to find contracts for them, but I don't think a free trade agreement or trade agreement is the right contract to put in all these things. Let me take a model, probably Australia. They were very present also at this conference. They have their disputes with China, like all of us, but they have quite a well-going trade. Why? Because they have a very thin, tiny little trade agreement, and that adds up to being the most important trade partner with China from their side. And I think that's the way to go. So I'm not a big fan of the European way of putting everything into a comprehensive agreement and then at the end not getting it ratified because there's 28, well, end of this month, 27 states not getting to a point of it, and that's not the right way to tackle the things, I think.
Just supplement what he said? I agree with him. You can't get everything into a trade agreement. But all the tracks need to be negotiated simultaneously. Otherwise, what we find is that trade takes center stage, where certain countries may be at a disadvantage, but other areas, so every country has a comparative advantage in some field or the other. Every country can't do everything. So we may have an advantage on services. We don't have investment surplus. Maybe Germany or America has huge amounts of money that they're looking at avenues to invest. So they want concessions on the investment side, but we may want certain concessions on the services side. So when you negotiate all tracks simultaneously, there's greater degree of possibility that you'll be able to get fair play in international trade or international negotiations.
Okay, very good point to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a lively discussion.
Thank you very much. Now we'll break for a quick 10-minute break in Shah Jahan. Please be back in 10 minutes while we start for the next session. Thank you very much.